Okay, Kaya, welcome everyone to CCWA's webinar and briefing and submission writing workshop on the WA government inquiry into the role of Western Australia in the global effort on decarbonisation. My name is Liam Lilly. I'm a campaigns researcher at the Conservation Council of WA. And just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. Can I just double check that everyone can see that first slide of the presentation and hear me okay? That's all coming up. Perfect. Good. Thank you very much. Nice. We're off to a good start. To begin, I acknowledge that I am here on Wajak Noongar Boodja, land that was never ceded, stolen land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay thanks and respects to all elders and senior knowledge holders for the care they give this land, both historically and ongoing. I also acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians from across the continent. So on to the webinar presentation. So the WA government is holding an inquiry into the role of Western Australia in the decarbonisation of its major trading partners. This sounds good, right? But what does it actually mean? Let's start with what we know. We know the WA government is actively focused on selling LNG to Asian markets behind energy security and decarbonisation greenwash. We know Roger Cook leads WA trade delegations to Asian countries to highlight WA's potential as a gas-fired energy exporter. And we know that WA has just recently approved the biggest new fossil fuel projects in the Southern Hemisphere in the Northwest Shelf. And we know fossil fuel majors like Woodside have an undue influence on Australian politics. But here is what we also know. We know that every increment of global temperature increase will intensify multiple and concurrent hazards, resulting in a clear moral imperative to confront the climate emergency in an urgent and decisive manner. To do so, there is an immediate need to phase out fossil fuels to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yet, WA is intent on enabling continued high fossil fuel usage and export through LNG, blue fuels, and materials and carbon capture and storage, what we call carbon pollution dumping, threatening to sabotage international efforts to limit global warming. WA needs to do its part and urgently reduce emissions to avoid the worst of climate change. So that leads us to why this inquiry. This is how Roger Cook frames it. Put simply, the benefit of WA helping other high emissions countries to decarbonise far outstrip the benefits of decarbonising our own economy as part of that equation. In 2019, Woodside commissioned a report on the emissions impact of additional LNG in Asia, which it subsequently buried because it concluded that gas exports were not decarbonising Asia. After the failed Woodside report, the WA government commissioned its own report assessing the decarbonisation role of Western Australia's LNG exports to Asia. You can see the little screenshot of an FOI at the bottom there. This was completed by Deloitte in January, but the government have refused to release it so far. What does it say? We don't know exactly, but the fact that the government won't release it means it probably doesn't speak too highly of gas's role in decarbonising the world. What a surprise. So now we have this inquiry where the government is desperate to come up with a public-facing document that gives it backing to carry on with its gas expansion plans. They're concealing a lack of ambition behind a cloak of activity and trying to convince the public that it is desperate to do something that it would rather leave undone. By participating in this inquiry, we have an opportunity to get the facts on public record, to engage media in positive stories, and to offer support and documentation to any potential or current climate champions within the WA government. These are the terms of reference as they stand, and it just by reading the terms of reference, you can see how it speaks to gas expansion in WA. So first of all, how LNG exports will provide energy security as they exit coal and transition to renewable energy. And then the second one there on blue and green fuels, such as hydrogen and ammonia. The third one being green iron. And lastly, the importance of carbon capture and storage to all of the above. Tonight, we're joined by two very special speakers that I'm very grateful to have on board today to take us through a few of those terms of references. Firstly, Thomas Hooley is a climate and energy policy analyst at Climate Analytics, specializing in mitigation policies and governance, decarbonisation pathways, and fossil fuel phase out in alignment with the 1.5 degree Celsius goal. And then we have Tom Quinn, who is Managing Director at Springmount Advisory. Tom specializes in the economic opportunities for Australia from building a clean and just economy. He has extensive experience working with peak environmental union, community and business groups with a focus on building strong cross-sectoral support for rapid decarbonisation and the creation of clean industries, secure jobs and prosperous communities. Thank you to the Toms for joining us tonight. I'll pass over to you in a second, but just quickly to run through the rest of the agenda. So Thomas is going to give us an overview on the state of the LNG, like WA's LNG export industry and gas as a fossil fuel. And then Tom Quinn will give us a green iron overview. We'll cross back to me and I'll run through the hydrogen and CCS elements of the inquiry and also touch on this threat of uranium mining that has propped up through this inquiry. Then we will pass on to Sarah English from CCWA, who will take us through the submission writing process. And finally, we will be joined by Jared Mazza and Millie O'Brien from CCWA to take us through a couple of calls to action. But now it is my pleasure to pass over to Thomas Hooley from Climate Analytics. I'll just stop sharing my screen, Thomas, so that you can start sharing yours.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Liam. There we go. All right, can you all see it? Oh, great. So I only have 10 minutes, so I'll try to be quick, but I just wanted to give a quick background on LNG and its role in Australia's trade and in Western Australia. So for a bit of background, we're Climate Analytics. We're a global climate science and policy institute, and our office in Fremantle focuses on Australia and the Pacific. So the most important thing about gas is that, unlike what the government would like, it's still a fossil fuel, just like coal and oil. So the industry and the governments like to emphasize that it is a clean alternative to coal and that it contributes to the decarbonization of our Asian trade partners. However, if you account for all the emissions associated with the world gas supply chain, we see that it's a much more mixed picture. That is because LNG has significant upstream emissions at every stages of the process. So in production processing, in liquefaction as well, and even in shipping and regasification. So when we put everything together, the actual life cycle emission intensity, so the amount, the climate impact of 1 unit of LNG compared to coal is actually, if we look at the median of the global supply, only 25% better than coal. So as the International Energy Agency says, it is not enough just to surpass the emission performance of the most carbon-intensive fuel to be a good alternative, and it's not because you're just slightly better than the worst option that you become a good option by default. So overall, with LNG being a carbon-intensive fuel, it is it comes naturally that it does not naturally support the energy transition in Asia. So those are graphs from the Future Gas Strategy, which is a document issued by the federal government last year. It looks at basically projections of Australian LNG export to different countries in different scenarios by the International Energy Agency. So here we have Australian LNG export to East Asia, so China, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, which are currently the main importers of Australian LNG. So the step scenario here is a scenario aligned with current policies. So just based on the policies in place in those countries that assume that there will not be any improvements in policies. Even in such a scenario, we can see that the Australian government project that LNG exports to those countries will decline in the future. Now, if we move to the APS scenario, which stands for Announced Pledge, which is a scenario where countries meet their 2030 target, 2035 targets, and potentially net zero goal, the demand is even lower. And finally, in net zero emission scenario, you get residual LNG export to those countries by 2050. So the more ambitious the climate scenario, the lower Australia's LNG exports. Now, the industry and the government also like to talk about Southeast Asia as a region with high economic growth that will kind of replace the legacy importers of Australian LNG. We can see that indeed with those projections, you have a steep increase in export to those countries in a scenario aligned with current policies. But even in the APS scenario, so once again, a scenario where those countries meet their own climate pledges, you don't have such an increase. And actually, LNG demands from Australia decrease as soon as the 2030s. So the STEP scenario was published last year. It is also really conservative. For example, Vietnam just updated their energy plan and they actually decreased the amount of gas in their plan to increase the share of renewables and nuclear energy actually, because they want to have more of a focus on energy security, and they're also concerned about the economic risk that comes with reliance on natural gas. Of course, in this whole picture, an important component is China, and it is an illustrative representation of what we can see to a lesser extent in some Southeast Asian countries. We can see that China is deploying a huge amount of solar and wind every year, and it is leading both fossil fuel in power generation, but also fossil fuel in final energy consumption, which means the consumption of fossil fuel across the economy, in industry, in building, to plateau, since it uses more and more electricity that comes more and more from solar and wind. But we don't need to look that far to find a country with currently a high reliance on coal for power generation and with renewable commitments, because that's also the case of Australia. And once again, only relying on data published by the federal governments, if we look at what the government projects for gas use in the power sector, we can see that it anticipates a steep decline in gas consumption for electricity between now and 2030. And the role of gas in the Australian electricity sector, which include the Swiss in WA, but also off-grid uses and the NEM, almost half between now and 2030. So those projections were published last December. This is why it remains stable after 2030. Now we have a 2035 target, so we can anticipate the next projections to show a decline as well post 2030, especially in the period from 2030 to 2035. And that is a consequence both of Australia's climate commitments, but also its renewable targets. Australia's climate commitments are not the most ambitious in the world, and there's some kind of irony in Australian policymakers saying that gas is needed to decarbonize the power sectors of countries abroad when it is not even the case here. So those graphs are from our report from last month. You can scan the QR code to read the whole thing. We have a section on fossil fuel exports phase outs. Now, in those graphs, The color line are results of 1.5 compatible pathways. So those are alternative scenarios that are aligned with the Paris Agreement goal of keeping global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And in those scenarios, considering the climate impacts of gas and LNG, you have a steep decline starting immediately to a phase out by 2040. And those scenarios show the same trends for all countries, not only Australia with its renewable potential. So for example, if we do the same kind of plots in Japan, and we look at 1.5 compatible scenarios for Japan, we can see that the role of gas in electricity decreases immediately and steeply. It gets phased out by around 2040. And gas use in the industry, so for example, the petrochemical sector or the chemical industry, also decreases at a quick pace to 2050. So there is no alignment with the 1.5 goal without a gas phase out in the short to mid-term. Something I wanted to mention briefly before passing this over to Tom is the risk of CCS, because it's a topic that we hear more and more about. In Asia and the Pacific, Australia and Japan have around half of the CCS projects at various stages of development. They also have 14 shared projects that they're jointly developing. A lot of those projects are still at early phases of development, so at the planning stage. Most of them are unlikely to go ahead because those are extremely capital intensive and heavy projects in terms of processes and approvals. It is, I would say, not a surprise that we hear more and more about CCS because the industry as a whole lobbies extensively for these kind of projects. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a study that came out that looked at where the funding for lobbying for CCS in the US came from. And out of the $1 billion spent on CCS lobbying in the United States between 2005 and now, the overwhelming majority of it came from the fossil fuel industry. So those gray blocks that you can see here. So the IPCC makes it clear that we might need some CCS in sectors that are complicated to decarbonize, like for example, cement or steel. But most of the projects in Australia are for gas-related projects. So for example, to build CCS infrastructure on LNG plants or domestic gas fields to sequester the emissions. And there is a huge risk that those projects will, in fact, kind of extend the lifetime of fossil fuel infrastructure and kind of lock in exports of LNG. And a really good example of this is the Gorgon plant in WA. So the implementation of CCS in this LNG project developed by Chevron was a condition from the WA government for the approval. So Chevron said they will build that CCS infrastructure. They get the approval. They build this massive LNG facility, which is one of the largest in the world. But the CCS plants that was supposed to sequester some of the CO2 emission from the gas liquefaction facility has been underperforming, leading to more emissions into the atmosphere. So in a recent report, we tried to look at the risk that a scenario with a high reliance on CCS would lead us to, looking at a more realistic capture rates of CO2. Because just like Gorgon, most of the CCS projects around the world have been underperforming. So a lot of fossil fuel companies say they can sequester and capture 95% of the CO2. But if you look at projects around the world, we're closer to a 50% capture rate. Now, if you take an IPCC scenario with a lot of CCS and with most of this CCS infrastructure underperforming, this could lead to really high emissions in the worst case. So this graph comes from a kind of worst case scenario. It will lead to emissions equivalent to the cumulative climate impact of South Korea since the Industrial Revolution, which is huge. So that concludes my presentation, and I guess we'll have time if there is questions or everything, and I can circulate the slides as well with the sources if that's of interest. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Thomas, for that in-depth overview of the LNG and CCS. Always appreciate your work and climate analytics ability to like digest that really technical, dense information and then communicate it in a really easy to understand way. I feel it's a pretty big shame though that we have to work so hard to relay that we can't be replacing fossil fuels with fossil fuels if we're going to reach our climate targets, but that's the world we live in at the moment. So thank you again so much for that presentation. Very helpful indeed. And now from one Tom to another, pass over to Tom Quinn, and a special shout out to Tom who's joining us from Naarm, Melbourne today. So he's actually 3 hours ahead now. So yeah, very special. Thank you, Tom, for staying up late to join us and tell us all about green iron and its role in decarbonisation. Thank you, mate.
Thanks, mate. Good to see you all. I'm actually from Ballarat, so Wominjeka from Jajawarong country, but I'm often in Naarm, and I'll hopefully be out your way very soon. Before I load mine up, I just wanted to say two other things in support of Thomas's piece. One is if we look at the two biggest LNG consumers in the world, which is at the moment China and Japan, they are huge. They're bigger than anyone else. Over the past 10 years, Japan's LNG gas demand has declined by 25%. It's just down, 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 down. And over the past 1 year, China's LNG demand is down 20%. And these are our major trading partners and the major off-takers for LNG, and they are turning away from LNG. They don't want it because it's expensive, and well, it's expensive, let's be honest, is the main driver for them. But the trajectory isn't up, it's down. And yeah, that's a reality I think the WA government needs to grapple with a bit more honestly. Alrighty, let me fire up green steel. Sorry, hold on a second. If I can get this into a slideshow mode. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to do a speed run through this. But last year we released a report called Forging Our Future, which was a joint project with a whole range of wonderful WA organisations, including CCWA. I'll get the link if you want to dive into a bit more deeply later, but mostly the focus of this is why iron ore matters from WA and why it's also such a critical part of solving the emissions from our trading partners, and why we need to make genuine green iron here rather than gas-based or none and just keep exporting. First off, and sorry if any of this is telling you to suck eggs, as you probably know much of this already, but each year Australia pulls out about 1 billion tonnes of iron ore out of the ground. We are the biggest producer in the world, generating about 39% of total global production. We, and in particular WA, is the big deal when it comes to iron ore globally. It also makes a huge impact in a budgetary sense in a way that LNG, to be honest, doesn't. Now, despite being such a huge producer, our iron ore basically goes to 4 countries. Interestingly, these are also the 4 countries that pretty much all our LNG goes to as well. But China takes the lion's share at about 85%, followed by Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Every single one of these nations turns that iron ore into steel using a blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace method, which is pretty much the most emissions intensive way of producing steel. We're starting to see a fair bit more scrap be recycled using electric arc furnaces, but basically our iron ore gets turned into steel using the most polluting methods. And as a result, our iron ore, and the Superpower Institute estimates it's actually a bit higher in terms of emissions, but on our numbers, we estimate we produce about 3.6% of the world's emissions through the process of converting the iron ore we dig up in the West Coast and combining it with the coal we dig out of the East Coast and turning it into steel in the furnaces of East Asia. So, it's huge. We produce about 1% of the world's emissions domestically, but 3.6 through the iron ore we're exporting indirectly. And when we look at our trading partners, the impact of the steel industry on their emissions is huge. Like really, like it even shocked me when we started to cut these numbers. So if you look at China, almost 16% of national emissions come from steel making. South Korea, it's over 16%. In Japan, it's almost 13%, and in Taiwan, it's 10%. So, steel making using our iron ore in these nations is a core driver of emissions. But this is the opportunity for us. If we're genuine, we can actually play a role capitalizing on our immense renewable resources and technical know-how to help by producing genuine green steel. We can help our trading partners drive down their emissions while maintaining strong industrial bases to produce, the appliances and cars and building steel and turbines that we need as part of the broader transition. This is probably a bit legacy, not too related to this, but basically the world is moving is the core thing of this. We are seeing increasing investment into electric arc furnaces, and thankfully we're now starting to see that in Australia as well, particularly if the Collie one gets stood up. When we published this, Australia was talking big, but getting virtually no investment moving. But the key challenge and why we actually need to move a lot faster and in a very genuine way is that despite being such a major exporter of iron ore, the quality of our iron ore isn't optimal for green iron production unless we do the R&D. And the reason our ore isn't optimal for R&D is because we haven't done the R&D. Sweden, you probably don't know it as an iron ore producer, but it is the major iron producer in Europe. You've also got Russia, which is a major producer, but Sweden produces a huge amount of iron ore and they turn it into steel. But what they pull out is heaps and heaps of magnetite. So they've invested in going, well, how do we turn magnetite into green steel, which is why they're standing up. We haven't done the same yet with our hematites. We're starting to, but this is the key challenge opportunity. We need to do the R&D to go, how do we turn our ores into green steel or green iron as an intermediary step? I'm hoping this has changed. I haven't updated. I've been on leave for 3 months, but when we published this, Australia had only attracted about 2% of global green iron and steel investment to date, which is just not good enough. Like, when you look at how big an iron ore producer we are and our potential to be a genuine green iron producer, we need to significantly lift the amount of investment going to this sector. So I'm just going to speed through this. This is all in the report, but we did 3 scenarios basically going, how do we actually stand up this sector? And basically said, we need to start with domestic. How do we start to meet our own needs and use our own procurement? But then the big opportunity is to work with our trading partners, in particular South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, to help replace all the iron ore they produce or the iron ore they convert into green steel, into steel currently, into green steel, because they are so energy constrained. It's going to be very hard for them to stand up a domestic, green steel industry. And then basically top and tail China, because China does have immense renewable potential and can stand up its own green steel industry, but we can probably do the specialty stuff on the edges. But we've got all that in there with lots of trajectories and what that means from a renewables and hydrogen front. If we did, it's going to require lots of renewables and energy, but will also create lots of jobs and lots of tax revenue is the main takeaway from this, and also drive down regional emissions by 274 million tonnes per annum in 2040, which is, that's big. That's a pretty big deal for a state like WA. That's how we can genuinely drive down the emissions of our trading partners. We've got a bunch of recommendations about how we do it. I'm not sure, I can just skip through, but if you've got questions afterwards, feel free to hit me up. But basically working with our trading partners, building out renewables through renewable energy zones, and capitalising government procurement are some of the key things we need to use, because it's how we've built industry in the past. And why recreate the wheel? We should just look at what's worked and do that again. And there they are in more detail, and we're at the end. So I'll stop there. There's a whole bunch more. My mind is a bit foggy, but if you have any questions, I'm sure I can dredge through the depths and see what's there.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's certainly some incredible numbers there, like an incredible scale of that global industry, like centered in WA. And yeah, obviously that presents an incredible opportunity for us to actually like help decarbonize the world through that green iron and green steel products. If you have a quick minute, are you able to touch on the definition of what green actually is? Because I know just recently there was a project up in the Pilbara that was approved by the WA EPA, which is kind of touted as a green iron, green steel project, but it's not actually going to be run on 100% renewables until 2049. So how important is the role of actually defining what green iron and green steel means?
It's very, very important. It's also very tricky, unfortunately, but it is critical. It's not also just defining what is green steel, it's also linking policy and incentives to that definition so that we're not just greenwashing projects which are not green steel. Like if we're using gas like methane to make steel, that's not green steel. That's grey steel. That's like Iran makes huge amounts of that. India makes huge amounts of that. It's not special. It's not green. It's just gas-fired steel making. We need green hydrogen or some of the other technology which might be suitable as well. If you want something to point towards, there are two organisations who are pioneering the definitions. One is GH2, which is Green Hydrogen Organisation. They are doing really good work in a very comprehensive way. It's not just the emissions, it's also the environmental impacts and the social impacts to do their definition. And there's a similar effort in Europe called Responsible Steel, who also have a responsible steel definition, which also sets a very clear benchmark about when we say green steel, we mean it's made using renewables in some form or another, whether that's through green hydrogen or direct electric arc production. It's not using gas and it's certainly not using coal. And you might think it's ridiculous to say coal, but Japan is trying to push what it calls mass balance, where its coal-fired blast furnaces basically just reduce their emissions a little bit, and then that's green. It's better than it was. No, that's bullshit. So yeah, we need to be very genuine in when we pursue green steel. It should be green steel, and sure, maybe the first project or two for the first couple of years maybe does need gas to stand up, but there is no excuse for a country with our renewables and with the industrial expertise of WA for us not to be able to produce green hydrogen at scale for this industry.
Great. Thank you for that quick overview, Tom. You wouldn't believe it, but we are behind schedule a little bit, and it's entirely my fault. So I'm going to try and catch us up a little bit here and just run through the dot point version of the rest of the terms of reference. So the next one was hydrogen. As Tom alluded to, there's different colors of fuels and materials. Blue and grey hydrogen are both made out of gas. The difference is that blue hydrogen has carbon capture and storage, a carbon capture and storage element attached to it to reduce the emissions. Though, as Thomas pointed out, carbon capture and storage is not a solution. It's really struggling around the world. So it is dependent on CCS for those emission reductions, but those emission reductions are minimal. And I think it was in terms of somewhere around 9 to 12% of an emissions reductions total, depending on the project and the success of the carbon capture and storage attachment to that. On top of that, when we have hydrogen used as a blending agent with gas as methane through pipes and as a fuel. It is not result in a one-for-one emissions reduction when you do replace it with the methane that is combusted and emits carbon dioxide. So say you have a 5 to 20% blending of methane into everyday gas infrastructure. That will result in a much less than 5 to 20% reduction in the emissions from that gas use. And then you can't really go above that 20% marker because of safety reasons. The infrastructure is set up to carry methane. Hydrogen is an explosive gas. It's also it's the smallest molecule in the universe. So it is very prone to leakage in pipes that are built for methane transport. And it is also not without its own environmental challenges. There are byproducts to its production and its use. And also, it is not a greenhouse gas in itself, but it's known as a secondary greenhouse gas because it interacts with things such as methane and water vapor to enable them to either live longer in the atmosphere or enhance their global warming potential. And we have seen recently, again, the kind of greenwashing of green hydrogen projects. This is the H2 Perth project proposed by Woodside down in the Kwinana industrial area. And this was proposed about 3 or 4 years ago as a green hydrogen project and facility. But over the years, it has slowly just shedded its green label, and now it is straight blue. And even then, the blue credentials are questionable because there is no functional CCS facility there that's coming along with this project at the moment. It's going to rely a lot on offsets, which we all know have their own issues. Sorry, just admitting someone there. And again, Woodside now in its latest proposal has completely dropped the green element of this hydrogen production proposal. So then again, quickly onto carbon capture and storage, what we like to call carbon pollution dumping. Thomas, grateful for you touching on this briefly in your presentation. But we know that carbon capture and storage projects have consistently underperformed and underdelivered, had cost blowouts and also time blowouts around the world. Nowhere is this better. There's no better example than this of the Gorgon project, which is in WA. And these facilities, these carbon dumping facilities, they act as enablers for fossil fuel expansion, as we saw with Gorgon, as we're seeing potentially now with Browse, that they put forward these carbon dumping facilities as, decarbonizing methods. But in actuality, all they're doing is enabling fossil fuel expansion. If Gorgon wasn't allowed to go ahead, we wouldn't have the massive amount of emissions that it is responsible for. But because it had this carbon dumping facility, which only when it works, reduces Gorgon's actual total emissions by less than 5%. Because of that, we get the rest of the 95% emissions that are not sequestered or abated at all. Also delivers a very poor a very poor return on public investment. We've seen the WA government and the federal government combined invest over $1 billion in carbon dumping technology, and there's going to be a lot more to come. And the amount of emissions reductions that it has produced it's questionable that it has produced any reductions because, as I say, it's an enabling mechanism for further fossil fuel expansion. But for the actual carbon dioxide pollution that it's been able to bury is a very poor return on the amount of money that Australia has poured into this. And as Thomas touched on, the global warming pathways that are presented by the IPCC and the IEA, as these are updated, they come to rely less and less on carbon pollution dumping being a climate change solution. This is because of cost and technological difficulties, whereas other things such as renewables are becoming much cheaper to implement. And also there's been some research published lately just alluding to the fact that carbon pollution dumping is a limited long-term resource, not a cure-all for our climate problems. And this is because there's only a limited capacity of viable storage facilities around the world, and this has recently been dramatically downgraded as well to about a quarter or a sixth of what it was previously estimated to be. And also the long-term feasibility of these storage structures, they have to stay intact for roughly 1,000 years in order to align with like climate emissions reductions pathways. And yeah, there's just no guarantee that these things are going to be stable for that amount of time. And quickly, last little bit here on this isn't actually in the terms of reference, but what we've seen through the opening of this inquiry is the uranium threat has popped up again in WA. Nuclear for Australia and other bodies are using this opportunity to push for uranium mining to open in WA as an emissions reduction pathway that they are spruiking. And this is just bad news on all fronts. We've just seen the nuclear election go by, and it was a disaster for the coalition. We know that it was just a front for the extension of the fossil fuel industry. It's going to take a long, long time for a nuclear industry to get up and running in Australia. But uranium in general is obviously radioactive and highly dangerous, posing health and environmental risks. It has the nuclear industry, as we know, again, like a big history of accidents and very dangerous spills and missing on regulatory requirements. It's also expensive, it's energy intensive, and it is in decline globally. Like recent CSIRO reports have it as the most expensive energy source we could possibly have. And at the other end of the scale, renewables are the cheapest option that we can have. It also produces nuclear weapons, which is often like the main goal of mining uranium. And obviously it produces long-term nuclear waste. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years that this stuff stays radioactive for, and we have no idea how to deal with that properly. And yeah, so the obvious solution is not nuclear, not uranium mining. It's clean, green, renewable solar and wind energy, both here in WA. And if we can help, produce embodied energy and materials and products that we can ship overseas, we do not need uranium mining or nuclear energy in order to do that. So yeah, we're calling for the implementation of a uranium mining mine in WA. So now, enough talking from us. I'm going to pass over to Sarah English, and we can start working on our submissions together. Sarah is going to run you through quickly how to make a submission, and then we'll have about 15 minutes, maybe just a touch under, to get some writing done on this submission. So Sarah, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Cool. Thanks, Liam, and thanks everybody for speaking tonight. And thanks to those who are here. It's always really nice going from coming up with ideas for these events and then writing an email to all of you and then seeing you, well, not in person, but seeing your faces here tonight. So thanks for being here with us. So that was a lot of information, and it might be new to some of you, or maybe some of it you already knew, but I thought it would be handy to share a summary of what we've talked about tonight, just so that you have an easy set of points to refer to. So I'll just pop that in the chat. So the first link is our mini submission that we've pulled together, and we're asking people to sign on. So you're welcome to go and have a look at that and read the summary of the points that were made here tonight. And you can also add your name to our submission if you would like to do that. And then the more substantial piece is writing your own submission. And because you've heard from our experts for the last 45 minutes, it would be really powerful if you could also write your own submission. And you're welcome to pull the points from our page if you want a reminder, or if you took notes or can remember, then yeah, go for it. So I will just share my screen. You're welcome to click the links and go for it if you would rather do that, but I'll also share my screen just in case that is helpful to people. Cool. Can you see that? Yep, fab, thank you. So this first page that I'm on now is our mini submission. And those are the points I was talking about that you might want to use to refer to. And you can also add your name on the side here if you would like to sign on to that one. And then the more substantial piece, which is more powerful, is the actual submission portal on the WA government website. And that link is the really messy link that I pasted. So if you click on that, just pop your details in the form, move forward. So when we speak to people who are on the other side of these inquiries, who are processing the submissions, it is more powerful if you make your name and your submission public. So if you are comfortable with that, we'd recommend doing that. So that's the top box, making the submission and your name public. But obviously, if you might work in you might have a conflict of interest, or you might work somewhere where you don't want people to know that you've made a submission, then please do keep that confidential and don't put yourself in a tricky situation. And then the submission itself is actually really simple. I mean, you can upload a file if you had something pre-prepared, but you may not. Most of us are just going to do that free text submission. So it's actually only one box, which is really unusual for an inquiry. Sometimes it's, like pages and pages. So that's literally it, just this box here. Type as much as you like, and then confirm you're not a robot. And that's it. Then you submit. So I'll shush now, and we'll have about 10 minutes, I think, realistically, to do this. So you should have the links, and yeah, you can keep those and keep writing after this webinar is finished as well, if you would like some more time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll check in about 10 minutes and just pass over to Jared and Millie for some quick announcements, but I'll leave everyone to get writing. Sorry, it didn't leave us much time to get writing in that short 1 hour session, but I should mention we have a whole bunch of information that we can send out to you. The submission due date is not until the 10th, this Friday, but importantly, you can ask the inquiry for an extension, and they can give you an extension until the 24th of October. So if you are feeling time pressured, there's a nice little relief there. But I suppose the most important part of finishing something is starting something, and hopefully we're all able to get a start on a submission at least tonight. But it was a very dense information session, so yeah, we can follow up with all of you, and please, if you have any questions, just get in touch with us if you need any help with your particular submissions. But now to wrap us up, I'm just going to pass over to Millie from CCWA's Better Climate team, and then on to Jared to CCWA from CCWA's Fossil Fuel team to make some quick actions, call to action announcements. Over to you, Millie. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks, Toms, for all of that great information. I hope everyone started their submission at least. I know that wasn't too much time to get it done, but I'm sure you will. So I'm from the Better Climate program, one of the teams that put this webinar together. And if you're kind of looking for that next thing, we are launching a bit of a workshop series because we've been seeing that there's been a lot of really not great climate announcements recently, some really disappointing policies being made, and we're not moving in a fast enough pace at the moment. So we're trying to reframe how we as a movement can act to demand climate change a bit. So I'm going to chuck the link in the chat. These workshops that we're doing are open to anyone who are trying to build a new and diverse movement with new strategies. And if that's interesting to you, please click on the link and RSVP to one of the events. We have one in October and one in November, and send it to whoever else you think would be interested. Thanks. I'll pass to Jared.
Thanks, Millie, and thanks everyone for being here, and thanks everyone who's been involved in organising this. I'm from the fossil fuels team, so I guess we are focused on the other half of the equation to better climate, looking at the many gas export proposals that exist in Western Australia, including the big Woodside ones, which we spend a fair bit of time on, but also things onshore in the Perth Basin, offshore as well, fracking in the Kimberley, and trying to break down the social licence of the gas industry and of those proposals. One call to action, if you just skip, I think, 2 slides ahead, Liam. Next week, there's a great event coming up. If you go to the next slide, Liam, there is a conversation event with Marion Wilkinson, who's just written a quarterly essay, Woodside versus the Planet. That's being hosted by the publisher, Black Ink Books and Beaufort Street Books. And that essay, I think, is a must read for anyone who hasn't read it. It really looks at how, for so long, the export conversation has been left out of the climate and energy picture, and how it's impossible to deny anymore how important that is. So it really fits in, I think, with what we've been talking about tonight. Might be some good background reading for your submission. And the event is next Tuesday at UWA at the Octagon Theatre. There's a link that I've just put in the chat for tickets there. So it'd be great to see a lot of you there, and to keep some of these conversations going there. Thanks, Ol.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jared and Millie. That brings us to 7:01 and the end of our webinar. We really appreciate all of your support. It is what keeps CCWA going. It's what keeps the climate movement and environment movement going in WA. We're certainly up against it here, but we just have so much more work to do and so many more campaigns to win. So we appreciate you coming on here tonight and getting some work done on these submissions. As I say, please get in touch if you have any questions, and we'll be sending out extra information to you very shortly. But that's all from us tonight. Have a pleasant evening, and I'll hopefully catch you all soon.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks, everybody.